Hi there, my name's Adam Fielding. For seasoned Reason users, flipping the rack around is a big part of what makes Reason so special. It's been a fundamental part of the software ever since version 1, and, on a personal level, I would cite the very first time I demoed Reason, flipped the rack around and saw those cables dangling as the exact moment when I knew I wanted to be a Reason user. However, not everybody's wired the same, and Reason 14's workflow and default auto-routing behavior have made it easier than ever to produce excellent music without getting lost in a virtual sea of cables. Now, you can comfortably create a tune entirely from scratch without ever flipping the rack around. That said, there are still plenty of reasons to flip that rack around. In this video, I'll cover some cabling basics, and then showcase some useful, real-world applications for messing with those patch cables. So, without further ado, let's go! First, let's talk basics. Everybody understands what cables do in the real world. You plug something in, and a signal flows from one point to another. Simple. Unsurprisingly, Reason works the exact same way, utilizing two main types of connector, which I'll cover using this simple rack setup featuring a synth, pulsar, and two effects devices. And that sounds like this. So first up, let's flip the rack around by pressing Tab. The larger cables here are used for audio connections, and they show the entire audio flow as it's generated in this Europa instrument, right through to these two effects units, and then back to its respective mix channel. So, say you want to remove the right channel entirely and just sum everything to mono. You can do that. Let's just take that out. You want to swap the left and right channels around? Easy peasy. Let's just do that. Now, you can trace the audio flow of any device in Reason this way by just looking at the audio connections here and just seeing where they go. So let's put that back to how it was. The second connection type I'm going to be looking at is the smaller ones called CV, or control voltage connections. Now, these are typically used to route control signals from one device to another. In this case, I'm routing a bunch of CV connections from this pulsar device. So, say you want to control the amplitude of one device with the modulator of another. Well, no problem. I've got that set up here. Say you want to control the modulation of a distortion unit that doesn't have a modulation section built in. Well, I've got that set up here too, and that sounds like this. These CV signals are so useful that there are even devices dedicated solely to producing CV signals without any sort of audio output, such as this pulsar device here and matrix devices. So let's have a look at a matrix device. There we go. That doesn't produce any audio, just CV. You may have also noticed that things can get a little messy when you're looking behind the rack and routing cables all over the place. So using the hide cables option in Reason is a huge help. So let's go ahead and do that. This hides all cables not currently associated with whatever device you've got currently selected, making things much easier to work with. This is turned on and off by pressing the K key. So let's turn it off and on again. New in Reason 14 is the ability to route cables from one connector to another without manually dragging them. So you can just right-click on any output and select an input using this handy contextual menu here. Great, you may be saying, but what are some actual uses for all of this cabling shenanigans? Well, let's go over a few. A nice and easy way of adding motion to a track is by adding subtle or not so subtle changes to the stereo field. So this can be easily accomplished using a pulsar and a CV connection. Now, a pulsar is a device that produces only CV outputs via a series of two LFO sections. So let's go ahead and generate one here. Pulsar. So let's flip the rack around, and we can take the output of LFO1 and connect that to the pan CV input of the mix channel of this device here. So that sounds like this. Now, at the moment, it's not a particularly pronounced effect, so we just turn the level up. We can turn the rate up, and it's going all over the place. That's quite extreme. Let's turn that down again. So you can control the level on the front of the pulsar here, or flip the rack around again. You can see this tiny little knob next to the pan CV input here. That adjusts the scale of whatever input's being fed into it. So you can turn that right down, and it's a much more subtle effect regardless of the level selection here on the pulsar. Now, I tend to use this technique to create sort of sweeping pads such as this. So it's kind of sweeping from left to right. Or say you've got a drum kit where you want to kind of vary the closed hat panning. So I've set up a pulsar here with the LFO outputs going to the CV inputs of the second mix channel here, which corresponds to the audio outputs from the closed hats. So playing that, you can hear those hats going all over the place. Turn it down. And there you go. So that's a nice way of adding just a little bit of extra spice without cluttering the sequencer up with unnecessary automation lanes. On a similar note, using CV signals to modulate pitch is an easy way to add drift and reduce ear fatigue when working on a track. So let's say you've got a nice drum pattern going using the redrum. Here's one I did earlier. But those closed hats are sounding just a little bit too static, just a little bit too machine gunny repetitive. So let's create an instance of pulsar again here. And let's take the output of the first LFO CV output, and let's route that to our closed hat pitch CV input channel here. Now, obviously at the moment, that is way, way too extreme. So we can adjust the waveform to a random waveform, adjust the rate to something a bit quicker, and turn the level right down. And we should end up with something a bit more acceptable. So just by adjusting the rate, the waveform, and the level of this LFO, you can introduce some really nice kind of subtle pitchy variation. So additionally, for some more variation, we could flip the rack around and we could take the output of LFO2 and plug that into the snare CV inputs. So let's turn on LFO2 and let's play that. That's way too high at the moment, so we can just turn that level down, make it into a much more subtle effect. So just by adjusting the level accordingly, we can introduce some slight pitch drift to the snare without changing the flavor of the sound. We've introduced stereo and pitch shift, but what about pattern shift? Now, I'm a fan of using the beat map player for adding percussion to an existing drum sequence, and that's exactly what I've done here. So I've got just a standard 4 on the floor kick with the beat map triggering the percussive elements, and that sounds like this. Now, that's great and all, but that percussion is really, really static at the moment. So wouldn't it be good if we could add a device that just automatically causes the beat map to go kind of all over the place and drift as we're playing it? Well, that's essentially what we're going to do. So I'm going to create an instance of pulsar once again. So we've got 2 LFO CV outputs we can play with. And I'm just going to take the LFO output from here and plug that into the X input on the beat map, and take the LFO2 CV output and plug that into the Y input on beat map. We're just going to turn on LFO2, and by adjusting the rate and level, we can adjust how much of an effect that has on the pattern. So now, when we play the pattern, it should the percussion should be a lot more varied than it was before. Now you could take this one step further by automating these dials on pulsar. So let's create some automation lanes here, close the rack view, and we're just going to have those fade in over the course of 4 bars. And now as we play it, you should hear the percussion become more varied over the course of these 4 bars. So that's great. Now we can control exactly where and how much pattern variation we want in our track at any given moment. Sidechaining is a term that comes up a lot, and it refers to the process of using one audio signal to change the behavior of another. Now, the most common application of this is in the well-known pumping effect, where the sound of a really prominent kick is used to duck the volume of another element, and that sounds like this. Now, Reason has a few ways of accomplishing this, and we're going to focus on using the built-in sidechain tool, which, handily, I've already put here. Now, this automatically ducks the signal of whatever's being fed into it based on a curve which is triggered by an external source, or, by default, automatically. So the audio output of our bass is going into this sidechain tool and out to the mix channel. And again, that sounds like this. Well, that's great if you've got a 4 on the floor type beat, but what if you don't? So I'm hopping over to our drum section here, and I'm going to get rid of this 4 on the floor pattern and introduce something a bit different. And now it sounds like this. Well, that's unfortunate. So, handily, on the front panel of sidechain, there are 3 different modes you can use. You can use trigger, which uses a CV input to trigger it, or sidechain, which uses an audio sidechain. So I'm going to hop on over back to the drums, flip the rack around. Channel 1 is our kick drum output. So I'm going to take the output of channel 1 and route that into the sidechain input of this sidechain tool right here. Now, we're using single rack view here, and because this is going to a separate rack instance, it kind of goes off to the left and you can't really see it. So this is an instance where you might want to disable single column views so you can have a look around and see where it's going. And it's going from drum output channel 1 into sidechain inputs here on the sidechain tool. So let's flip that around and play again. Now, that's great and everything, but the problem is now we've taken the audio output of channel 1 and it's going into the sidechain input of the sidechain tool and then nowhere. So that's not ideal. So let's go back to where we were originally. Just undo all of that. Now, let's create what's called a spider audio merger and splitter. I'm going to pop that there. Now, this is a useful utility which you can use for merging and splitting audio signals. So I'm going to take the output of channel 1 and have that go back to where it was going originally. That's going to be split into 2 here. So the output of channel 1 is going into here, and that's going back to where it was originally. Now we're going to right-click here and put that back into the sidechain tool, left and right inputs. And presto, there it is. Now that's triggering exactly as you would expect, but the problem is, I think we can all agree that's a pretty messy solution. We're having to add mergers and splitters. Now, I mentioned before there is a CV input trigger we could use instead. So let's use that. Let's go back to the drums and let's put those back to how they were. So lots and lots of undoing here. There we go. Now, in this instance, I'm not going to mess about with the audio output. Instead, I'm going to remove that gate output. I'm going to take the gate CV output from channel 1 and route that into the sidechain tool's trigger CV input here. So now we can see that's going off to the left here. And there we go. That's handy. So let's go back to single column mode, go back to the bass, flip the rack around, and let's give that a listen. Now the pumping effect is triggered by the CV signal of the kick, and the audio is completely unaffected. In a previous video, I mentioned that you can frequently use the built-in effects of Reason's instruments on other devices using some simple audio routing. So here we've got a nice little drum pattern that sounds like this. And I want to get funky with some filter processing. So what am I going to put in the insert effects section? So I thought it'd be nice to pop in an instance of the Maelstrom grain table synth. Now you might be thinking, why on earth have you just put a synth in the effects section? And what does that sound like? Well, at the moment, it's not doing anything. But we're going to flip the rack around. And there is a audio input section on the back of Maelstrom. So if we take the Insert Effects to Device connector, plug that in there, and plug the right channel into filter B, we'll take the output A and plug that into From Left, and From Right is automatically connected. Now, when we press play again, we should be able to hear the audio being processed through filter A and B. I'm going to turn the spread up, so now the left channel is going to be processed by filter A and the right channel through filter B. So let's add some comb filters. Now that's kind of cool. Now, because we've done this, we can use Maelstrom's built-in modulation to modulate those filters. So let's modulate the filter curves and hear how that sounds. So that's kind of cool. Now by automating filter A and filter B, we can go back to the sequencer and we can decide when we want those filters to be activated. So let's have them come on for a bar. And that sounds like this. So that's a really good way of adding just like a nice transitional element or adding like a little fill, and utilizing a synth in a way that you might not have otherwise considered. A nice and easy trick I use all the time is to layer up drum sounds in ReDrum without having to duplicate sequencer or pattern lanes. So say for instance you've got a nice little drum beat that sounds like this. So we've got a nice punchy snare, but say you wanted to layer it up with a more noisy layer. Now channel 2 is our punchy snare and channel 3 is our noisy layer that sounds like this. So we're just going to flip the rack around, take the gate output CV from channel 2 and route that into the gate CV input on channel 3. And that sounds like this. So now we've got 2 channels being triggered by 1 note. Now you can take that one step further. Say you've got a 3rd channel with a clap on it that you want to include. Let's turn that down a little bit. Now you can flick the rack around again and take the gate CV output from channel 3, which is being triggered by channel 2, and route that into the gate CV input of channel 4. Now we press play again. So we're triggering 3 individual channels using 1 note. Now you could take that one step even further. There's nothing to say you have to keep using one device with these CV signals. Now you might have noticed I've got an instance of Mimic over here, and that sounds like this. So let's go back to ReDrum, flip the rack around, and right-click on the gate CV out connector here. Go to Mimic 1, and let's put that into the sequence gate input CV connection on Mimic. And now when we press play, that sounds like this. So from that one individual note there, that's triggering 4 individual channels, one of which isn't even connected to the ReDrum. Neat. Finally, one of Reason's unappreciated gems, in my opinion, is Thor's built-in step sequencer. Now, there's loads of Thor patches that make use of the built-in step sequencer. Here's one I created earlier from the Reason Plus sound pack, Cyclical Motions, and with the Thor on its own, it sounds like this. So you press one key and it plays the built-in sequence. Nice. So looking at the front panel, you would assume that there's no way of using Thor's step sequencer with any other device. But as you probably guessed by now, there absolutely is. So let's flip the rack around. Now I've got a polytone instrument handily placed here. And you can see on the back of Thor, there are CV outputs for note and gate for the step sequencer. So if we just take the note CV output from the step sequencer and plug that into the note CV input on polytone, and take the gate CV output and plug that into the gate CV input on polytone. Now what should happen is when the step sequencer is running, it should trigger both the Thor and polytone. Now, most devices in Reason, most instruments include these note and gate CV inputs, so you can use Thor's step sequencer to trigger pretty much anything. And together, that sounds like this. So this is kind of a best of both worlds scenario because I'm able to combine Thor's distinct sound and step sequencer with the lovely tone of polytone. So as I said, this means you can take any one of Thor's many step sequence patches and use it to trigger or layer up with another instrument altogether. And there we have it, a healthy selection of real-world uses for flipping the rack around in Reason. While on the surface Reason is already an excellent tool for song creation, I think it truly becomes a greater than the sum of its parts offering once you start working behind the rack. Of course, this is just a simple selection of uses for flipping the rack around in a regular setting. The real fun starts when you start combining these techniques and principles to create something unexpected and new. Do you have any favorite tricks when you flip the rack around? Let us know in the comments, and until next time, happy noise making. Cheers.